He looks upon sky and steppe and sees that which God has created. I look and see God himself. Stephen Pressfield. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for listening so far, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the last couple of weeks. This week we'll be focusing on kind of the last section of Asia, as we cover the Eurasian steppe and the forests kind of to the north of that area, up until the Ural Mountains. So, let's go ahead and get right into it. The steppe begins in the east of what is now Russia, and of course in the very northeast of China, what is now referred to as Manchuria. And this runs all the way to the west. In fact, it runs, into Europe, hence the name the Eurasian steppe. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to start right around where it terminates. Not where it terminates, because it keeps running, as I just said. We're gonna continue until you get to the Ural Mountains, which is kind of one of the traditional borders associated between Europe and Asia. So this is going to terminate kind of in the western part of Kazakhstan, at least what we're covering for this episode. We'll continue, of course, when we get back to Europe, which will be in a couple of weeks once we deal with Australia and the rest of Australasia. So, of course, this is obviously a very large area to cover. Now, the steppe itself is kind of a cold tundra, or a cold desert, I should say. There is minimal vegetation for a lot of the year. What vegetation there is mostly grasses, wild grasses, and it is. There are, of course, some trees, things like that. However, they're almost entirely located around water sources, and there are sources of water. This isn't a true desert, say like the Kalahari or the Namibian desert. There are places like Lake Baikal out on the near Mongolia and Russian border. There are, of course, water sources in the Caspian Sea area, and there are, again, numerous long rivers that kind of run north to south through the area. And then the further north you go, you run into kind of a dark tree or forested areas, and these are home to their own peoples. There are several different groups living in that area that we in the West don't really think about, and they're even in modern Russia. You think of Russia as kind of a very unitary state. There's actually several what are referred to as republics, probably inaccurately, but they're basically made up by a large group of indigenous or near indigenous peoples. But the peoples we're going to start with or we're going to first focus on are the peoples of the steppe. At 10,000 BC, we're not exactly sure. I guess there are different groups even today. There are, of course, Kazakhs, Mongolians, Manchurians, different varieties of Turks, Uzbeks, Tajiks. These are all kind of a steppe people. And at 10,000 BC, there are obviously, again, not that many different groups, most likely. There are probably some cultures hanging around. It used to be thought that Mongolian Turkic speakers had a kind of were part of what was known as the Altaic language family. That even included Korean and Japanese. However, a lot of modern scholarship disregards this, especially, at least when it comes to comparative linguistics, like that's kind of completely disregarded now. A lot of the similarities you see between Mongolian, Turkic, and the like can be explained just due to proximity to each other and just sharing of loan words. That they're actually very different languages. At least that's the majority opinion today from linguistic scholars. So Altaic is not really considered a true family anymore. There has been some attempts at revision that kind of says, well, there is an Altaic language. It just doesn't include that wide of a range. And there are still some that do kind of hold on to the original Altaic supposition, I guess, for lack of a better term. But that is a very, very small group. I think in terms of genetic evidence, what they've been able to determine, there's nothing really definitive. Of course, a lot of these peoples, that are kind of, in that supposed group, there is some overlap, but the overlap comes later. And it comes at different times for different groups. So obviously, any kind of Korean and Mongolian overlap is probably from the Mongolian Empire period, whereas the Turkic and Mongolian overlap is, probably much earlier. And again, it could have happened a couple of times at different periods. And these steppe peoples, kind of what we're referring to is after the domestication of the horse, which is going to be a very important animal in this area especially, and of course eventually to the rest of the world as well. But that is still a couple of thousand years from this point in time. At 10,000 BC, they're probably just hunting, if not horses, antelope, deer, wild animals out on the steppe. And about the horse specifically, they had a much longer or much larger range. We talked about how, there was a die-off of animals, right around the time the Pleistocene kicked up. Horses had spread virtually the entire length of the steppe in Asia all the way to the European coast in what is now France and Spain. Of course, once the climate shifted to that warmer period at the Pleistocene, a lot of these horses died off, probably due to overhunting, probably due to the nature of the food of their foodstuffs changing, the climate evolving, and of course being hunted by humans and other predators. So eventually there are just pockets of horses around the European coastlines, and then there is a very big blank slate, but like kind of in Central and Southern Europe, where there are no horses anymore. Even on the European side of the steppe, they are eventually gone, and then so essentially somewhere in the Northern Caucasus, Central Asia, and kind of central, the mid part of where Central and Eastern Asia meet, out where now is kind of like the border regions between Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and that very kind of tip of China. That's where the horses are kind of concentrated. So, they are, they are important, and we do begin investigation on them eventually. But for this point in time, they are almost certainly like a major food stuff in the area. And of course, you know, the kind of vegetation humans are eating are probably not all that great. So I imagine, the nomadic lifestyle for these people is probably very high. They're probably having to move a lot compared to, say, people in China or India or the Middle East. Of course, everyone's nomadic at this point, but I imagine that where they're living, the population density is even less than what you might consider, further south, which makes sense, obviously, just due to terrain and things like that. Now, in the north of the steppe, you have a few different peoples. Today, their descendants probably speak some type of Uralic language. These would include things like Nenets, Inets. Those are kind of the Russian groups. The Samoyedic is a term I've seen used for them. I don't know if that's considered kind of I don't know if that's PC these days. As far as I know, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. But there are probably also, various types of Permic speakers, Udmurt, Zirian, Permayak, which, again, we're going to get into these peoples in the future when they're more readily identifiable. And it's possible that these people could be more on the European side of the Urals, or they're making that trek back and forth. It's very hard to say at this point. And in this kind of northern forested region, you're not going to be able to live there for long periods, or at least be very successful living there for long periods, just due to the weather, because while it is warmer on a whole, it is still very cold. I think, you can get into the sub-zero temperatures, at least when it comes to Fahrenheit. My Celsius is a little off, but it's very cold there for a large part of the year. What you probably have is people moving into the forested regions during the summer, and then once the weather begins to change, they're probably moving south along rivers and trying to get to valleys on the outskirts to kind of live during the colder months. And even then, where you're living in the steppe is still very cold. I can't imagine, having to make that type of... And there are people, obviously, that still live in the area in a very near traditional lifestyle. We're talking, and that far north, you've got, periods of time where the sun doesn't shine for, a couple of months on end. It's a very, it's kind of hard to imagine, honestly, for someone who's never dealt with that before. But yeah, so that's what we have in terms of people's kind of living at that area at 10,000 BC in Asia. I should bring up horses. Now, again, we're a few thousand years before they're domesticated, but it is important to note that, as odd as this may sound, is horse hunting is very dangerous, believe it or not. We think of horses today, they're much taller. We generally think, of kind of, the danger with horses is riding them these days. However, horses at this point in time do not look the same way they do today. They're not nearly as tall. They're not as big. A horse, typically a male, would probably be at most like 5 feet tall. So maybe almost the size of a human. But of course they're longer. I think they're about 7 feet long. And they probably weigh around somewhere between 500 to 700 pounds. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less on the low end. And male horses are extremely aggressive, like wild ones. They will fight not just to defend their territory. They are, aggressive almost to a fault. They fight each other, obviously. Horses are kind of a mix. Wild horses are a mix kind of between a matriarchal hierarchy and a patriarchal, just kind of a stud or a stallion, that's kind of in charge, and they're around the exterior of the group, whereas the interior, the matriarchy kind of keeps the rest of the herd like in line on the interior, whereas the stallion is on the outskirts of the group, protecting them from outside threats. So they do have to be very aggressive to kind of keep control of their herd. And we'll get into that more when we talk about how horses were eventually domesticated. But just be aware that male horses, very dangerous. They will charge. They will try to trample, stomp on people. They kill wolves. They can, obviously, their back legs can fuck you up just as badly as their front legs. Even male horses also have very sharp. They have a small number, but they are very sharp, almost fangs that they use to bite and protect themselves, or just be aggressive to other horses and predators. And speaking of wolves, obviously we have domesticated dogs by this point, maybe at a couple of different points in time, depending on the group. But, wolves are still around, and they're still considered one of the major dangers on the steppe. So, you have to be, of course, worried about them. And they are as much of a food source as, unfortunately, dogs probably would have been. I think if times were tough, people may have had to make some unfortunate sacrifices for the good of their human families, unfortunately. That is something to keep in mind. Domesticated animals, the byproducts are wonderful, but there's always the possibility that you may have to sacrifice them, both for sustenance and, as we may have seen at this point, for religious purposes. Sacrifice is very possible to have been started at this point. I know I haven't talked much about religion outside of Africa because, again, we're kind of, we've had a lot of different overlap and interaction between them. So kind of coming up with a foundational myth or kind of an oldest myth outside of Africa is very hard. But I did mention it at, if not at this point, within the next couple of 100 years, we're going to see kind of the earliest monumental art in a place in Siberia known as Shigir. There are about 5 meter tall planks carved to look like humans, and they have other signs. So this is, I guess, your kind of your earliest non-stone Neolithic art, like massive rituals stuff that you found. Siberia will actually beat out Asia for the first bit of monumental construction. Not by much, and of course, what you see in Siberia is made out of wood, whereas in Anatolia you're talking about stone stuff. So, but again, that's for future episode. We'll get there eventually. Let's see. So horses. Of course. Another thing that we're probably hunting is, of course, reindeer. They would have ranges, of course, as well. But yeah, so I think that is probably as much as we can discuss at this point in time. That's kind of hard facts. And even then, maybe not the hardest of facts. But that kind of finishes up what I want to discuss about Asia at 10,000 BC. So I just kind of want to sum up, kind of what we're seeing at this point in time. We have seen that once leaving Africa, some groups had continued to travel. If this was due to, we're not exactly sure to the reasons that this happened, especially when you look at the groups kind of living in, kind of the first area once we left Africa, Arabia, the Mesopotamia, and of course the Levant. These regions seem like they have a very wide and diverse source of food. So, of course, why did people kind of continue leaving? It could have been a number of reasons. It could have been they were following favored foodstuffs. They could have been stuck in that mode of megafauna hunting. The people, they've been moving for thousands of years. And I think what this shows is that once the megafauna have died off, different groups are answering their, the lack of these food sources in different ways. Obviously, in places like Mesopotamia, the Indus River the Indus River areas, places around the Xinjiang in China, and the Yellow River, places like those. Being along those riverbanks are excellent sources of vegetation to eat, and they're also kind of sources of animals as well. Obviously, animals aren't coming from the water, but they're coming to the water. Whereas, outside of those regions, the people living kind of in the more inhospitable areas, in the kind of the highlands of India, or in the very heavy rainforest areas of Southeast Asia, or even the steppes in northern Asia, and of course those forests in northern Asia as well. They obviously have sources of food, but it's a much harder life than the people that remained in and around those river sources, and that's going to play important factors in evolution, culturally, as well as economically speaking, I guess, for lack of a better term, mode of living, as it were. But again, all that is kind of future episodes that will kind of go into more detail on that. But kind of just to keep this in mind, so the people living in and around these river valleys are going to be best off. And we will see why going forward. Now, next week, we will cover Australasia, Australia specifically, and of course the surrounding islands that have people on them at this point in time. I wouldn't think that episode would take more than one, possibly two. I'm still kind of, plotting out or outlining what I want to talk about for that region. And then after that, we're going to go to Europe. So I'm hoping by the end of August, we will have, let's see, we should have Australia and part of Europe done. And then, of course, by the end of September, I want us to at least be in the Americas. But we'll see. Again, I'm still working on outline stuff, so it may take me a little bit more time. But we should have a pretty good grounding to finish 10,000 BC before the year is out, and then after that, we're going to move into we'll take a big time jump. We'll jump forward to about 8,000 BC after that, and catch back up with these various groups I've outlined in other episodes. But that being said, I do obviously have a little bit of work to do still before we finish out this section. I am going to be doing a little something different in October, and I mentioned that in the last episode. I have gotten some feedback on Twitter about kind of the kind of fictional area that people might want me to do like a little Halloween special or episode on. I've gotten a little bit of feedback there. I'm going to be kind of talking about Glorantha, which was an early competitor, for lack of a better term, to D&D, or maybe not so much a competitor, but like a very kind of a similar concept, less focused on the wargaming and more focused on the storytelling aspect, and it spawned a couple of things. So that is, I might do 1 or 2 episodes on that. But if you guys have any kind of historical fantasy kind of thing you'd like me to do an episode or 2 on for Halloween, I guess, the spooky month of October, just let me know. But yeah, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you, and goodbye.